There is a passage in the Gospel of Matthew that many people hear so often that they stop truly listening to it. A story about a wedding, 10 virgins and lamps burning in the night, while they wait for a bridegroom who seems delayed. At first glance, it sounds like a simple cultural image from another time. But underneath it is something far more direct, something aimed not at an ancient audience, but at anyone who reads or hears it today. The setting is a wedding, but not like the modern idea of a short ceremony. In that time and place, a wedding unfolded across hours and uncertainty. The bridegroom would leave his home, go to claim his bride, and then return at an unpredictable hour, often deep into the night, for a procession that led to celebration and feast. Those waiting for him had one responsibility: remain ready, with light prepared, because when the procession finally appeared, there would be no warning and no second invitation. 10 young women are placed in this waiting role. 10 lamps are lit. 10 people begin the same night with the same expectation. At the surface, everything looks equal, but the story quietly introduces a difference that is easy to miss at first. Each lamp is small, designed to burn only for a limited time. They are not meant for endless waiting. They require preparation beyond what is immediately visible. Anyone familiar with the custom would know that oil had to be kept in reserve, because delays were not unusual. The wise understood this. The unprepared assumed the initial flame would be enough. As the night stretches on, something happens that changes everything. The bridegroom does not arrive when expected. Time passes. The waiting becomes heavier. Eventually, all 10 fall asleep. That detail alone is important, because it removes a common misunderstanding. The story is not dividing humanity into those who sleep and those who stay awake. Even the prepared grow tired. Even the wise cannot sustain constant vigilance. Human limitation is shared equally among them. Then, without warning, the moment arrives. At midnight, a cry breaks the silence, announcing that the bridegroom is coming. Everything changes in an instant. Lamps must be ready. Light must be present. The procession is already on its way. It is here that the difference, invisible for so long, becomes undeniable. 5 of the women are ready. They have kept reserve oil. Their lamps can be relit. 5 others discover too late that their preparation was incomplete. Their light is fading, and nothing remains to sustain it. In panic, they turn to those beside them and ask to share what they lack. But the answer they receive is not what they hoped for. What has been prepared within one life cannot simply be transferred at the last moment to another. They are told to go and buy oil, but by the time they leave, the moment has already passed beyond their reach. The bridegroom arrives. Those who are ready enter into the celebration, and the door is closed. When the others return, breathless and too late, they knock and call out. But the response they receive is one of the most unsettling lines in all of Scripture. I do not know you. Not because they were strangers in life, not because they were never invited, but because readiness is not defined by presence at the beginning, but by preparedness at the moment of fulfillment. The story ends with a single warning that echoes beyond its setting: remain watchful, because the hour is unknown. What makes this parable so difficult is not its imagery, but its proximity. It is not presented as something distant or symbolic of a far-off event alone. It is framed as a reflection, a warning that the difference between readiness and unpreparedness is not visible until the moment it is tested. And that is where the weight of it begins to settle, because the delay in the story is not just about a bridegroom, it is about time itself, about how easily expectation replaces preparation, and how quickly assumed readiness can collapse when the moment actually arrives. This is where the message begins to shift from history into something personal. The waiting is not only in the story, it mirrors something deeper in human life, the assumption that there will always be more time, that preparation can be postponed, that what is missing can be addressed later. But the structure of the parable refuses that comfort. It insists that there is a moment when preparation can no longer be borrowed, transferred, or reconstructed under pressure. When that moment arrives, what matters is not intention, but what has already been done. And that raises the question: the story never stops pressing forward, not in theory, but in reality. If the moment of arrival is unknown, then readiness cannot be postponed without risk. And if readiness cannot be borrowed at the last moment, then it must exist before the moment ever comes. That is where this reflection turns, because the story is no longer only about 10 figures in an ancient setting. It becomes a way of examining what it means to be prepared for a moment that cannot be predicted and cannot be delayed once it begins. The night in the parable is not just darkness in the sky, it is uncertainty itself. And the cry at midnight is not just an announcement, it is the sudden arrival of what has always been moving closer without being seen. What remains now is the question that quietly follows every line of the story, not about the bridegroom and not about the delay, but about the state of readiness when the moment finally arrives. What the story presses forward next is the uncomfortable realization that the uncertainty in the parable is not accidental or decorative. It is the entire structure of the warning. The delay is not a flaw in the narrative. It is the condition under which every life is lived. In the language of the Epistle to the Hebrews, there is a statement that sharpens this even further. It is appointed for human beings to die once, and after that comes judgment. That sentence removes the illusion of indefinite postponement. It does not speak in probabilities or possibilities. It speaks in appointment, something fixed, something already set within the structure of human existence, even if unknown to the person living it. That is why the delay in the parable matters so much. The bridegroom does not arrive at a predictable hour because the point is not predictability. The point is exposure. The waiting reveals what was actually being prepared long before the moment arrived. In that sense, the midnight in the story is not just a time of day. It represents the moment when hidden reality becomes visible. It is the hour when what was assumed to be sufficient is tested and either stands or fails. And the unsettling part of the teaching is that no one in the story knows when that hour will come, including those who are ultimately ready. This is where the second layer of the parable begins to emerge. It is no longer only about preparation in a general sense, but about the danger of assuming that preparation can always be deferred. The foolish virgins are not condemned for refusing the invitation. They are not outside the story from the beginning. They are part of the waiting community. They have lamps, they are present, they are included. And that is precisely what makes the warning more severe. Because inclusion is not the same as readiness. This is where another teaching of Christ echoes into the same theme. In the parable of the rich man who stores up his harvest, he assumes that having secured material provision, he has secured time. He speaks to himself as though the future is guaranteed, but the response interrupts that illusion directly. This night your life will be demanded of you, not later, not eventually, that night. The point is not that death is always imminent in a dramatic sense, but that it is always outside human control. The assumption that there will be a later moment to correct what is unfinished is exactly what the teaching destabilizes. That is why the oil in the lamps becomes such a central image. It is not something dramatic or visible. It is not fire itself. It is what sustains fire over time. It represents what has been quietly prepared, not what is displayed. And in the structure of the parable, it is not transferable at the moment of crisis. It cannot be borrowed when urgency arrives. That detail matters more than it first appears, because it shifts responsibility entirely into the present, not into intention, not into identity, but into sustained preparation. The most unsettling part of the story is not the sleep. All 10 fall asleep. The text does not distinguish them at that point. Exhaustion is universal. Human limitation is shared. The difference only appears when the call is made. That is the moment everything becomes irreversible. When the cry goes out at midnight, the wise and the foolish are awakened at the same time. They hear the same announcement, they face the same urgency, but they do not meet it with the same internal condition. 5, discover that what they have is enough. 5, discover that what they have is already gone. And in that instant, the separation is not emotional or symbolic. It is practical, it is functional. It is defined by whether light can still be produced. The request to share oil is one of the most human moments in the entire parable. It reflects instinctive reasoning. If others have what is needed, it should be transferable. But the refusal is not presented as moral rejection. It is presented as limitation. Some realities cannot be transferred at the moment they are required. They can only be cultivated before that moment arrives. That is why the narrative does not focus on punishment as much as consequence. The door does not close as an act of personal retaliation. It closes because the procession moves forward. The celebration begins. The moment passes its threshold. And what remains outside is not rejected in anger, but excluded by timing. When the late group finally arrives, the words they hear, "I do not know you," carry a specific weight. It is not a denial of memory or invitation. It is a statement about alignment, about being present in the condition required for entry at the moment entry becomes possible. This is where the teaching moves beyond its original scene and begins to press into the structure of human awareness itself. Because what the parable reveals is not only that the timing is unknown, but that preparation cannot be outsourced to a future version of the self that may or may not exist in the same clarity or willingness. And that leads directly into the second implication that follows from the story. If the moment cannot be predicted, then living as though there will always be additional time becomes a form of risk that is not visible until it is too late to correct. The parable does not ask for constant anxiety. It does not describe frantic alertness, all 10 sleep, but it does question assumption, the assumption that what is required can always be produced later. And that is where the reflection begins to shift inward again, because the question is no longer about ancient figures on a road at midnight. It becomes about what is being quietly accumulated or neglected in the present, what is being prepared without urgency, and what is being postponed under the assumption that later will be available. The story does not answer that question directly. It leaves it open, but it narrows the space in which denial can comfortably exist. And from here, the teaching continues to deepen into what that readiness actually means in practice, and why the difference between the wise and the foolish was never visible until the exact moment when visibility mattered most. The next layer of the parable turns away from the moment of arrival and focuses instead on something far less visible but far more decisive, what the oil actually represents, and why it cannot simply be improvised when the crisis arrives. Within traditional interpretation found throughout the Catechism of the Catholic Church and long-standing Christian theology, the oil in the lamps has often been understood as grace lived and maintained within the soul, not as a one-time possession, but as something that is sustained through ongoing relationship, practice, and response. In that sense, the distinction between the wise and foolish virgins is not about appearance or even belief in the abstract. Both groups are present, both are waiting, both have lamps. The difference is in what has been quietly preserved beyond what is immediately visible. The foolish virgins represent something subtle but serious, a form of participation that is real but incomplete. They are not absent from the story of faith. They are not hostile to the bridegroom. They are part of the waiting community, but their preparation exists only at the level that can be seen. The lamp is there, but what sustains it over time is not. This is why the delay matters so much. Time exposes what immediacy can hide. When everything begins, outward participation can look identical. But when waiting extends beyond expectation, only what is internally sustained continues to function. That is why the story emphasizes the gradual fading of the lamps. It is not sudden failure. It is depletion over time. Something that once burned brightly begins to weaken because nothing has been added to sustain it. And by the time the crisis arrives, the process cannot be reversed quickly enough. This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable, because it challenges a very human assumption that presence is the same as preparation. The foolish virgins were present. They were part of the group. They were not excluded from the beginning, and yet presence alone did not guarantee readiness. When the crisis moment arrives, their first instinct is to request what they lack from those who prepared. But the response they receive reveals a structural limitation, not a personal judgment. What sustains readiness cannot be transferred instantly from one person to another at the moment of necessity. It is not a commodity that can be divided under pressure. This is why the wise virgins respond the way they do, not because they lack concern, but because the timing has already reached a point where redistribution is no longer possible without loss. The preparation that sustained them was gradual. It cannot be replicated in an instant without consequence. And so the foolish virgins are directed elsewhere. They leave in search of what they should have secured earlier, but in doing so, they miss the moment entirely. When they return, the structure of the scene has already changed. The bridegroom has arrived, the prepared have entered, the door has closed. This is where the emotional weight of the parable becomes most intense, because the closure is not accompanied by extended explanation or negotiation. It simply marks the transition from waiting to fulfillment, from anticipation to completion. And once that transition occurs, the conditions for entry are no longer the same. The phrase, "I do not know you," must be understood in that context. It is not a statement of surprise or sudden rejection. It is a declaration about relationship in the moment that now defines reality. The opportunity for alignment has already passed. What makes this moment so difficult is that nothing in the behavior of the foolish virgins suggests rebellion. They did not oppose the bridegroom. They waited for him. They responded when they heard the call. But their response came after the point where response was still effective. This is where the parable begins to speak not only about belief, but about timing. About the danger of assuming that readiness can be constructed at the exact moment it is required. The story does not deny intention. It questions delay. And beneath that, it introduces a deeper idea, that preparation is not measured at the moment of crisis, but accumulated long before it arrives. This is also where the image of oil becomes more precise. Oil is not created in urgency. It is stored. It is gathered. It is preserved gradually. It is the result of consistent attention over time, not a reaction to sudden need. That is why it functions as the dividing line in the story. It reveals what was done quietly when no immediate pressure was present. The wise virgins are not portrayed as fundamentally different in emotion or desire. They are not described as more enthusiastic or more visibly faithful. Their difference lies in continuity. In what was done while waiting seemed uneventful. And that is where the story begins to press into reflection, because the waiting period is where most of life actually takes place, not in crisis, but in ordinary time, not in dramatic moments, but in repetition. And the parable suggests that what is formed in that ordinary time determines what is available when extraordinary moments arrive. This is why the sleep of all 10 virgins becomes important again. It shows that readiness is not about constant intensity. It is not sustained alertness without rest. It is something that exists beneath the surface of ordinary human limitation. But it also shows that when nothing has been built beneath that surface, the moment of awakening reveals the absence instantly. And so the story continues to narrow its focus, from the visible event to the hidden preparation behind it, and now toward the deeper question of what kind of life quietly produces readiness without relying on the assumption that there will always be time later. Because in the structure of the parable, the moment of arrival is not what creates the difference, it simply reveals it. And that distinction is what carries the teaching forward into its next stage. The parable takes a sharper turn at this point, because it begins to expose a detail that is often overlooked. The wise and the foolish do not differ in outward participation, but in what they have quietly sustained beneath that participation over time. When read through the lens of traditional Christian interpretation, especially in works associated with the Summa Theologica, the oil is frequently associated with the interior life of grace, formed not in a single moment, but through repeated acts of faith, charity, and repentance. Not as abstract ideas, but as lived habits that shape the soul over time. What makes this important is that both groups in the parable begin in the same condition. They are all invited. They all respond. They all carry lamps. There is no visible separation at the beginning of the night. That equality is intentional because it removes any assumption that readiness can be identified from external appearance alone. As the waiting continues, the difference remains invisible for a long time. Even the delay itself does not immediately expose it. All 10 grow tired. All 10 sleep. There is no spiritual superhuman among them. The parable deliberately avoids that distinction to make one point clear. Human limitation is universal. But when the moment of announcement finally arrives, everything shifts instantly. The cry at midnight does not create the condition of readiness, it reveals it. In that sudden transition from waiting to fulfillment, what had been sufficient becomes insufficient for some, while for others, it remains stable. This is where the request for oil becomes one of the most revealing moments in the entire passage. The foolish virgins do what any rational mind would do under pressure. They turn to those nearby who appear to have what they lack. It is an instinct rooted in urgency and proximity. But the response they receive is not emotional, it is structural. What has been developed over time cannot be transferred instantly without loss. The wise virgins do not refuse out of indifference. They acknowledge limitation. The preparation that sustained their lamps was not something accumulated in excess for redistribution at the final moment. It was what allowed them to remain ready themselves. This is where the parable quietly dismantles a common assumption that readiness is a shared resource that can be accessed collectively at the last moment. Instead, it presents readiness as something personal and cumulative, tied to a life already formed, not a situation suddenly entered. The instruction for the foolish virgins to go and buy oil introduces urgency, but also exposes consequence. The very act of leaving confirms that what was needed could not be generated instantly. It required time that is no longer available within the unfolding event. And while they go to secure what they lacked, the decisive movement of the story takes place. The bridegroom arrives, the prepared enter, the celebration begins, and the door closes. The closing of the door is not described as emotional or dramatic in tone. It is procedural. It marks the transition from anticipation to completion. In ancient wedding customs, once the procession entered and the feast began, the structure of participation changed. Entry was no longer open-ended. It was defined by timing, not desire. When the foolish virgins return, they are no longer in the same temporal position as before. They knock and call out, repeating the language of recognition and belonging. "Lord, Lord, open to us." But the reply they receive is not a negotiation. It is a final statement of misalignment. "I do not know you." Within theological reflection, this phrase has never been interpreted as ignorance on the part of the bridegroom. Rather, it expresses a lack of relational correspondence at the decisive moment. Not absence of prior invitation, but absence of readiness when presence was required. This is why the parable ends not with explanation, but with warning. "Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." The emphasis is not on fear, but on awareness, on recognizing that timing is not controlled by expectation and that delay should not be mistaken for absence of consequence. At this point, the parable begins to move beyond its narrative frame and into reflection on human life itself, because what it reveals is not limited to a single event, but a pattern, that what is sustained quietly over time determines what is available when sudden moments arrive. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable in a different way, not because it introduces judgment, but because it removes certainty about delay. It refuses the assumption that there will always be a later moment equivalent to the present one. The wise are not described as flawless. They are not immune to sleep, fatigue, or delay, but they are consistent in one critical way. They have already done what could not be done at the last second. The foolish are not condemned for ignorance alone. They are shown to have assumed that what was necessary could always be obtained when needed. That assumption collapses in the moment of truth. And so the parable continues to press toward its central implication. Readiness is not a reaction, but a condition formed in advance. Not visible until tested, but decisive when tested arrives. From here, the reflection moves deeper still, toward what kind of life quietly builds that condition, without relying on the assumption that time will always remain available for adjustment. At this stage, the parable shifts from description into urgency, because it begins to confront one of the most persistent assumptions in human life, the belief that there will always be a later moment to correct what is unfinished. In the teaching tradition reflected throughout the Summa Theologica and broader Christian moral theology, this assumption is often treated not as open rebellion, but as spiritual presumption. It is the quiet expectation that time will remain available for repair, regardless of how it is used now. The parable directly challenges that mindset by structuring its entire narrative around unpredictability. The delay of the bridegroom is essential here. It creates a long space of ordinary time in which nothing appears to change. 10 lamps remain lit. 10 people remain waiting. Nothing external signals the internal difference between them. This is precisely why the story is so effective as a warning. It mirrors how life often feels when there is no immediate crisis. But the turning point arrives without gradual warning. The cry at midnight is not introduced by preparation signals or extended transition. It is sudden, and in that suddenness, it compresses all hidden preparation into visible consequence. What becomes clear in that moment is that readiness is not produced in response to urgency. It is revealed by it. The foolish virgins are not given additional time to construct what is missing in real time. They are exposed by the absence of what could not be created instantly. This is why their request for oil is so significant. It is not only a request for help, it is an assumption that what is lacking can still be supplied under pressure. But the structure of the moment does not allow for that assumption to hold. The wise virgins, by contrast, are not portrayed as possessing excess. They are portrayed as having what is necessary for their own participation, nothing more. That distinction is important. The parable is not describing spiritual abundance as something stored for redistribution at the last moment. It is describing sufficiency that was cultivated in advance, without reliance on emergency transfer. When the foolish virgins leave to obtain what they lack, the narrative introduces one of its most decisive transitions. While they are away, the bridegroom arrives. Those who are ready enter. The door closes. This sequence is not framed as emotional punishment, but as completion of process. The wedding begins when the bridegroom arrives. Once that begins, the structure of participation changes. Entry is no longer open-ended, because the moment of waiting has ended. When the foolish virgins return, they find themselves outside a reality that has already transitioned. Their knock and their plea are sincere, but they occur after the defining moment has passed. The response they receive, "I do not know you," functions not as a statement of emotional rejection, but as a declaration that recognition belongs to a prior state of readiness that was not present when it mattered. This is where the parable becomes most difficult to reinterpret comfortably, because it refuses to place the failure in dramatic moral categories alone. The foolish virgins are not depicted as enemies. They are not portrayed as rebels or outsiders. They are participants who misjudged timing. And that misjudgment is what defines the entire warning. The final line of the parable, "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour," is not an invitation to anxiety. It is a statement about limitation. Human beings do not control the timing of decisive moments. They only control what is formed before those moments arrive. This is why the story places so much weight on ordinary time. The long waiting period is not empty space in the narrative. It is the only space where preparation is possible. Nothing dramatic happens during it, and that is precisely the point. What matters is not what is done under pressure, but what is quietly sustained when pressure is absent. The wise virgins are not defined by intensity at midnight. They are defined by consistency before midnight. Their readiness is not improvised. It is accumulated. And so the contrast that emerges is not between activity and inactivity, but between preparation and assumption. One group assumes the future will allow correction. The other behaves as though the present is the only reliable place where preparation can actually occur. That difference, invisible for most of the night, becomes irreversible in a single moment. From here, the parable pushes its reflection one step further, away from the mechanics of the story and toward the deeper question it leaves behind. What kind of life quietly forms readiness without relying on the certainty of additional time? The final movement of the parable brings everything back to a single, unavoidable point. The moment of arrival does not negotiate, and the condition you are in when it arrives is the condition that defines participation. In the closing line of the teaching from the Gospel of Matthew, the instruction is simple but absolute. "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." It does not explain the timing, It does not soften the uncertainty. It places the weight entirely on readiness formed before the moment becomes visible. By this point in the narrative, every illusion of control over timing has already been removed. The delay is unpredictable. The arrival is sudden. The separation is immediate. And what determines inclusion or exclusion is not desire in the final moment, but preparation that existed before it. The return of the foolish virgins is the final emotional echo of the story. They arrive with oil, but not at the time when oil matters. They knock, but not at the time when the door is still part of waiting rather than completion. Their words express recognition and urgency, but the structure of the moment no longer corresponds to their readiness. The reply they receive, "I do not know you," must be understood within that structure. It is not a statement of ignorance or sudden rejection. It is a statement of timing, of arriving after the condition for entry has already been defined and sealed by the unfolding of the event itself. The door closing is not described as an act of anger. It is described as the natural transition from waiting to fulfillment. In the logic of the parable, once the bridegroom arrives and the feast begins, the time of preparation ends. Entry is no longer based on intention, but on alignment with the moment that has already arrived. This is what makes the parable so enduringly challenging. It does not present a scenario where last-second change is possible. It instead emphasizes that certain transitions, once they occur, cannot be reversed or re-entered through delayed action. The wise virgins are not portrayed as extraordinary figures. They are not elevated by dramatic contrast or exceptional emotion. Their difference is subtle and quiet. They acted during the time when action was still meaningful. Their readiness was not created at midnight. It was revealed at midnight. And that is where the teaching shifts from narrative into reflection on human life itself. Because the structure of the story mirrors a broader pattern. The most decisive moments in life are rarely predictable, and they rarely allow time for reconstruction once they arrive. This is why the emphasis throughout the parable is not on fear, but on attentiveness. Watch, therefore, is not a call to panic. It is a call to recognize that waiting without preparation creates vulnerability that only becomes visible when it can no longer be corrected. In that sense, the oil in the lamps is not simply a symbolic object. It represents what has been sustained quietly over time, without reliance on emergency repair. It is the accumulation of what cannot be instantly manufactured when urgency appears. The final contrast in the parable is therefore not between those who succeeded and those who failed in a dramatic sense. It is between those who treated waiting as a passive assumption and those who treated waiting as an active responsibility. One group believed that readiness could be assembled at the moment of need. The other group understood that readiness must already exist before need arrives. And once the moment of arrival comes, that difference becomes irreversible. What remains after the door is closed is not simply exclusion, but realization. The realization that presence at the beginning of a process is not enough if it is not matched by continuity through it. That participation without preparation eventually reaches a limit that cannot be extended by urgency. And so the parable ends where it began, in waiting. But now the waiting is understood differently. It is no longer passive, it is charged with meaning, because it is the only space in which readiness can still be formed. Everything else in the story flows from that truth. And what remains with the reader is not a conclusion, but a question that mirrors the entire structure of the narrative itself. If the moment of arrival cannot be known, then what kind of preparation is being built in the time before it? The parable does not answer that question for you. It leaves it open, because the answer is meant to be lived rather than simply observed.